These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. A few episodes back, when mentioning the trouble with popular mistaken histories in ancient times, I made a mention of Graham Hancock, just to cite one popular example of a mistaken history. In the comments of that episode, I had a Hancock fan call me out for condemning the man without really understanding his ideas, and I realized that this commenter was exactly correct. I shouldn't have been condemning someone without understanding his ideas. At the time, I had some vague notion that he claimed to have proof of some Ice Age civilization with advanced technology, and also that he feels very persecuted in the podcast episode I'd heard him on a while back, but no, I didn't really have any real idea what he based it all on. But it is inappropriate for me to criticize someone openly without really knowing what the foundations of their ideas are. And so I've read through what appear to be his two flagship books, Fingerprints of the Gods and Magicians of the Gods, as well as a book he wrote an introduction for and seems to reference on Göbekli Tepe. And he is a genuinely good writer. I got the audiobook for Fingerprints of the Gods, and he narrates it personally, and he has a wonderful old British voice with real passion behind it. I find it genuinely hard to believe, as some claim, that he is some sort of grifter. I think he comes by his unconventional ideas honestly. He's genuinely done a lot of work in his career, and he's written a boatload of books. And I will say this, I give him a lot of credit for his ultimate conclusion and how he puts it forward. I don't ultimately think that his theory of a globe-spanning civilization during the Ice Age is well supported, even by the evidence he presents, but the sense I get from his book is that he is himself in constant search for more evidence. What he wants, I think, more than anything else, is to have more people conducting more archaeology. And so long as it's all done responsibly, his work in bringing attention to the understudied sites and hopefully also enthusiasm and funding for advanced, expensive archaeological techniques like large-scale LiDAR and underwater archaeology, all of that can only bring in more data that will ultimately be of benefit for the human stock of knowledge. He seems to me to be far more beneficial to the field in general than the ancient aliens people, as those guys seem generally, at least in my readings of Sitchin all those years ago, less interested in pulling up new evidence or finding human explanations to human stories. Hancock is, however, fundamentally off the rails somewhere. And while we're going to look at a few examples, this episode is not a systematic takedown of all of his books. I mean, I don't think I could go into that much detail and remain charitable throughout as he deserves. Rather, the whole reason that I'm doing this is that Hancock is wrong in a very interesting way that's going to get us into the philosophy of archaeology itself. And I think the most illustrative example is that in looking him up, I rarely see him labeled as an archaeologist because, of course, he has no formal training in the subject. I mean, neither do I for that matter, but we live in an era where most of the humanities can be profitably self-studied by someone with the right motivations and resources. Though, of course, Hancock is an example of the dangers of self-study without a corrective institution to guide you. Instead, he's usually labeled as a journalist, and most tellingly, I once saw him referred to as an asker of questions, and this is a fundamental mistake that gets at the heart of what archaeology is. There is, as it turns out, an entire sub-discipline called the Philosophy of Archeology, dealing with extremely long-winded debates about what is the past, considering the merits and the shortcomings of various methodological approaches in the field, and also quite a lot of academic fart-sniffing, the sort of which afflicts all such abstract academics. It all begins with an underappreciated question: what is the past? Now, this is one of those questions that seems very simple. The past is everything that happened before you started listening to this podcast. The present is you listening to this podcast, and the future is what happens after this episode ends. Archaeologists are largely not worried about elaborate metaphysics like A and B theory of time or relativistic synchronicity or what have you. However, they do run up with the hard fact that the past is fundamentally unavailable. Whether or not the past exists in the present, it is totally inaccessible to us, and can be only known by what we find in the present. In simpler terms, we can't go back to the Assyrian Empire. Probably a good thing, all things considered. The only reason we know it exists at all is because of things which still exist in the present. There are objects that have been recovered, writings which have been translated, stories which are told today, deformations in the earth where cities once stood, as well as the genetic and cultural legacy of their descendants who still live today. But none of these things are the Assyrian Empire. They are cups and texts and stories, and sometimes little more than scratches in the soil or stones that are situated in series. And it isn't always obvious that human hands are responsible for the arrangement of what we see at a dig site. Indeed, I remember when I was younger, there was a human face that was found on some hill on the planet Mars. And for all the appearance of agency that was with that, it does seem that with better imagery, this apparent shape was the product of natural wind erosions. Similarly, how many potsherds and arrowheads have been missed by builders and diggers outside of the archaeological field simply because they didn't recognize these human artifacts as anything but natural, usually because they weren't looking for anything special. Now, archaeology begins from this ultimate fact. Now, when I was digging in my house's foundation, I found a really cool shell fossil in the dirt. The question then arises, how did that shell fossil get there? I know that fossils are not archaeology but paleontology, but the underlying matter is the same. Of course, being in the middle of construction, I wasn't taking careful note of the context, and I may have missed quite a lot. So, if we were to assume that there was no context at all here, there's fundamentally no way to know anything about that shell, except that it currently exists and has this or that shape and material properties. Without further context, one could posit that perhaps some ancient community brought this shell here hundreds or thousands of years ago from another place. One could posit that the animal with this shell died here hundreds of thousands of years ago or millions of years ago and fossilized. One could suggest that it never was an animal, but some pattern of erosion formed a normal rock in this neat pattern. In Monty Python style, one could posit that it was carried by a pair of very lost swallows, as fossils don't typically migrate. On a more practical level, it could have been brought to this area in much more recent times, either by the early settlers of central Texas or even by the previous holders of this land prior to the 1970s, and just gotten mixed up in the dirt during a round of land clearance or something. More exotically, but not impossible, it could have been thrown from miles away by a volcano or a meteor impact somewhere else. Or it could have been a ritual object left at this site by a lost Ice Age civilization. Or it could have been moved here by ancient aliens, or it could have been created ex nihilo via the magical energies of some manner of jinn, fairy, or demon. The point is that I didn't excavate my house's foundation in an archaeologically sound fashion. I was just trying to get it built as soon as I could. Additionally, I've never excavated my yard in any sort of systematic fashion. Therefore, I have very little of what archaeologists would call context, properly speaking. Which means that this item, as cool as it is of minimal historical value. Now, I won't say it has no value. I am in the central Texas hill country. The soil around here is all basically limestone with a few inches of dirt on top, and so there is a broader context. Geologically, we know that this limestone is all seafloor deposition from the age millions of years ago when this whole area was underwater. So this context makes it rather likely that the fossil was deposited in that area and then not unearthed until my rented skid steer disturbed it. However, that remains one theory, and I genuinely can't rule out the other theories that I mentioned earlier. I could have destroyed the remains of a small cowboy-era encampment, or there could have been a midden pile under a hill in one of the trees, or the dry creek bed nearby could have washed away evidence at one point during our occasional flash floods that we get here. I genuinely can't say that it's impossible some Comanche, Tonkawa, or Cohuitecan community brought it from some other location and left it here either intentionally or by accident. And I also can't say for sure it's not some more modern intrusion like the beer bottle caps from the 1970s that definitely originate from my father's youthful misbehavior on this land. In an abstract way, it's hard to really understand the point of the archaeological method. We see it intuitively in examples, and in fact there is a lot of similarity with the detective work that fills so many books and movies. But the inaccessibility of the past is important. What we have now, what we build in podcasts like this, is not actually the past. Obviously, I can never capture the full richness of the past, and many of the details are missing or may have been incorrectly inferred. But at an ontological level, I can never tell you the past. I can only ever convey a certain story about the past, something fundamentally different from living, experiencing, or knowing the past. And I can only reconstruct that story from the items which exist today. Now, as someone who studies Mesopotamia, I am unusually spoiled. Very few places on Earth preserve history as well as Mesopotamia does. And being that the Mesopotamians both invented writing first and invented it on a very durable medium, means that we have not just artifacts, but the actual living thoughts of these long-dead ancestors preserved into the present, sometimes after 5,000 years. And the written record that I base so much of the show on is a very different sort of evidence, a new dimension of context than most other ancient researchers have to work with. I don't know that I'm explaining this well, but let's get into Mr. Hancock's work for a contrasting set of examples. I'm only going to cover 3, but this isn't to cherry pick. Once you follow the archaeological heuristic, you're going to be able to see in nearly all of his examples that his method is tragically and fundamentally flawed. First, I want to read you a bit from Magicians of the Gods, near the beginning where he's talking about Göbekli Tepe, the genuinely fascinating site at the Anatolia-Mesopotamia boundary, which was constructed some 10 or 12,000 years ago. There is outstanding debate as to whether the site was constructed by pre-agricultural people or by proto-agriculturalists, and to what degree they were settled, but either way it remains an interesting site, and it's good that Mr. Hancock is drawing attention to it. He begins with a somewhat poetic accounting of his visit there, and again, he's a good writer, but he gets to the point of it in this section, which is a discussion of the curious fact that Göbekli Tepe seems to have been buried at some point in the past. The fellow he's working with supposedly says that we can be confident about the terminus dates of this site because the carbon dates associated with the infill tell us when the site was no longer used. He follows this up with this. The point he makes about dating is interesting, for at least three reasons. First, the implication is that at megalithic sites around the world where this sealing process didn't happen, the dates archaeologists have arrived at could be falsely young as a result of the intrusion of later organic materials. Theoretically, this means that famous megalithic sites that were not deliberately buried by their builders, the temples of Malta, for example, or the Taulas of Minorca, or the stone circles of Avebury and Stonehenge in England, could turn out to be much older than we're presently taught. Secondly, if the bulk of the dates at Gobekli Tepe are derived from organic materials in the fill, then this tells us only about the age of the fill. The megalithic pillars themselves must be at least that old, but they could be older since they stood in place before being buried for, quote, a period of unknown duration. Thirdly, and perhaps most important, why was the site infilled? What could possibly be the motive for going through all the trouble to create a series of spectacular megalithic circles, only to end up deliberately burying them so thoroughly and so efficiently that more than 10,000 years would pass before they were found again? The first thought that comes to my mind is time capsule. That Göbekli Tepe was created to transmit a message of some kind to the future, and buried so that its message could be kept intact and hidden for millennia. Now, this is an interesting theory to extract from a singular data point, but the truth is, you can draw an infinite number of lines through a single point. Later in his story, he's going to draw upon the idea that the Gobekli Tepe people were advanced enough and somehow motivated enough to want to transmit a message to the future. It would, by the way, be quite nice if he published a more academic tome wherein he omits the poeticisms and lays out his particular claims item by item and directly connects each to his ultimate thesis. But he's, so far, not done this, and manages a lot of his inference by splitting up the data like this, so that if you have difficulties around one section, by the time he mentions it again, you've sort of forgotten the details, and he can transform a momentary but interesting speculation into an established fact. To be a bit uncharitable, I do feel that clarity is not his ally. Anyway, a wrong response to Mr. Hancock here is to say that he is clearly mistaken, since the accepted academic consensus is that Göbekli Tepe was a ritual site or proto-city, not a time capsule. But to merely assert this based on academic consensus is to miss the point. Mr. Hancock is here claiming that the expert consensus is wrong, and that the infilling means that the Gobekli Tepe people must have wanted to preserve their site for the future. He already has a theory that there was an advanced Ice Age civilization which was catastrophically destroyed, and so it would seem that he has a context that this is helping to fill in. Except that he doesn't. Remember, he's using Gobekli Tepe and most of the examples in his books to help establish that such a civilization exists. But what he actually uses these data points for is for understanding details about this civilization that he's implicitly already assuming exists. And the reason this is bad is something in archaeology that gets called the ladder of inference. Now, the short version of this is that archaeological evidence needs to prove the foundational aspects of the piece of evidence before it can prove the more interpretive and uncertain things. You start with a base of empirical data, the artifacts, the stratigraphy, the ecology, and you take things as a whole, not just bit by bit. At the first layer of this ladder of inference, I guess the first rung, you don't have a theory of the site, You just have a catalog of details. At the next rung, you provide a functional interpretation of the artifacts. At a very basic level, you decide whether a rock is just a rock or if it's an arrowhead, for example. And if it seems purposeful, you map out the thing's practical function. For Göbekli Tepe's big rocks, the functional purpose is to stand up and support the weight of the higher stones. Then you determine a cultural attribution, comparing this site to other sites, and there do seem to be a cluster of similar sites from a similar era in Anatolia. Only then can you start to figure out social and economic implications of the materials that you find. And for a real archaeologist without a written record to supplement the finds, this is often the speculative top of the ladder, the most tentatively held and prone to revision. But the level after that is where you start getting into making guesses about the symbolic, religious, or cultural interpretations of the site, which is the time capsule that Hancock has jumped to. The top of the ladder, the one even Mr. Hancock knows he can't quite reach, is building an historical narrative, which either requires a written record or a very extensive archaeological program in a region. It's because Mr. Hancock has jumped up the ladder of inference without first establishing the lower rungs that his methodology is unsound. It isn't even wrong. There isn't any strong reason to say that Göbekli Tepe wasn't buried as a time capsule. However, we do have parallel burials of ritual sites from many other places in the world where we can actively see the reasons, and these reasons usually are not time capsule. To pick an example, ritual sites can be buried to represent the religious function of a place being changed, such as when Muslim conquerors buried the holy relics of the Hindus underneath their mosques, so that the Muslims in India can walk over the Hindu relics in triumph every time they pray. Or it could be a more peaceful sort of burial, sending the site kind of to the afterlife. That happens sometimes. There are even theories that the burials in Göbekli Tepe may have been a result of an earthquake or a landslide, something that really isn't that uncommon in Anatolia. But we can't say that any of these are the case, since the Göbekli Tepe investigations are still methodically building their case in a responsible fashion, one artifact at a time, building out this wider context through this web of evidences, of actual physical evidences, and that is what's going to pull this investigation up the ladder of inference just as far as the evidence will support them. To then emulate Mr. Hancock, we're going to just suddenly move to a wholly unrelated site in a different country. About halfway through Fingerprints of the Gods, he's in Egypt, hanging out in the pyramids. And this is irritating, straight up. He boasts of how he bribed the pyramid guards to go crawling around in the protected areas of a pyramid, which is a profoundly irresponsible thing to boast about. Corruption is rife in Egypt. It isn't some particular virtue that a wealthy Englishman fed into that system, and it is unwise to boast of it in a popular text. How many potential pyramid vandals do you think he's inspiring? I don't think that the pyramids of Giza are actively under continuous excavation, at least not at the tourist areas, but even beside that, you don't go traipsing about an archaeological site just for the thrill of it in order to include a gripping anecdote in your book. You are likely to disrupt the context of the area that you're running through. But that's beside the point. He's hanging out at the pyramids, and he goes over to the boat museum, where they have an ancient ceremonial boat on display, well preserved from the elements. Now, those who are channel members on YouTube or on Patreon have recently heard a bit about the significance of these boats in the episode on the contendings of Horus and Seth, available for all Patreon and YouTube channel members. There's a plug, it's an ad. But yeah, these boats are genuinely impressive. And Mr. Hancock is right to wax poetic about their virtues. He writes, "Another authority felt that the careful and clever design of this strange pyramid boat could potentially have made it, quote, a far more seaworthy craft than anything available to Columbus. Moreover, the experts agreed that it had been built to a pattern that could only have been, quote, created by shipbuilders from a people with a long, solid tradition of sailing on the open sea. Present at the very beginning of Egypt's 3,000-year history, who had those as yet unidentified shipbuilders been? They had not accumulated their long, solid tradition of sailing on the open sea while plowing the fields of the landlocked Nile Valley. So where and when had they developed their maritime skills?" Now, Mr. Hancock opened this very book, Fingerprints of the Gods, with a long discussion of the Piri Reis map, which we'll discuss in a bit, and that map includes the region around Egypt. The fact that he calls Egypt landlocked is simply unforgivable. But even assuming that he genuinely believed that the Egyptians were restricted to riverine traffic, the answer to his question is one that everyone listening to this podcast already knows. They got it from Byblos. That ship was built in Byblos, not by some unknown shipbuilders, but by Byblos. We don't know specifically if it was Byblos or if it was one of the other Levantine cities famous for shipbuilding and seafaring even this far back in history. But he ends this section with an unanswered question, as if there was not a very easy and nearby answer to it, an answer which he should have known. Even if the boat was produced in Egypt itself, the technology and the skills involved had been purchased by the Egyptians from the Levantine region going back to the pre-dynastic period, and who's to say there are genuine scholars who think that there was at least some level of indigenous Egyptian shipbuilding tradition, even at a very early period, despite all the stuff that they imported from the Levantine coast. And genuinely, it's hard for me to get past this and not just call it outright deception, but I want to focus instead on the methodological error here. He's taking a piece of data that there were some really impressive boats very early in Egyptian history, and he's contextualizing it irresponsibly. Basically, we can say that he's got 3 possible dots, and he's trying to figure out how to connect them. His first dot is this ship. His second dot is the presence of Lebanese seafarers who have a long, storied, and well-evidenced history of interacting with the Egyptians. His third dot is that it came from an ancient Ice Age civilization. And he draws his line from dot 1 to dot 3, except if you'll pardon my increasingly poor metaphor, there isn't actually a dot 3. He's assuming that there's a third dot, an ancient Ice Age civilization. He's drawing a line from his boat to his third dot, and then he's saying that this line proves his third dot. This is not how you contextualize things. Remember that ladder of inference? You start with a site or an artifact. Then you need to figure out what's around that site or artifact. Then you need to identify a function for those artifacts. Once you've done that, you can begin to contextualize the artifact culturally by asking, what other people nearby use the same sort of artifacts for the same sort of purposes? And this is not the process that Mr. Hancock is using. His process is to come up with a neat narrative and then find items that fit that narrative and ignore the items that don't. Real quick then, to finish this part out, the Piri Reis map. In 1517 CE, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis made a map of the Atlantic which included parts of the recently discovered Americas. It is a genuinely cool map. And once again, Mr. Hancock has done a good job in drawing people's attention to something genuinely interesting. But then, down at the bottom of the map, there's a bit that sort of looks like Antarctica. In fact, it sort of looks like Antarctica when it had no ice over it. Dun dun dun! It isn't exact, but if you squint, you can sort of see the resemblance. Add to this the fact that there is apparently a single letter in which some U.S. Air Force commander in the 1960s says that there's a lot of similarities between the two and is unable to come up with a reason for what that might be, and suddenly Mr. Hancock has enough evidence to show that A, Antarctica must have been ice-free during the Ice Age, B, a civilization must have mapped that coastline, and C, Antarctica must have moved thousands of miles in only tens of thousands of years. Now, I don't care that much about the geological claims. I would expect such a large tectonic shift to be a lot more catastrophic and leave a lot more evidence than I think currently exists, but I'm no geologist, not even an amateur geologist, but I can talk about the history of maps and bring us to our next methodological issue, that of evidentiary chains. For many historical claims, when we claim that one thing exists, it often entails that another thing that must also exist contemporaneously. And if we can't find that other thing, then we need to revise our theory. As an example, if we say ironworking entered Assyria in the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse, then we would not only need to see iron tools and weapons, but we'd also want to find ironworking sites, smelters, forges, and so forth. Evidence that's actually been so difficult to find that there is a theory that much of the early iron arrived only as imports. Similarly, Mr. Hancock states that Piri Reis, the Ottoman admiral, knew the coastline of unfrozen Antarctica. Now, since even Mr. Hancock acknowledges that the southern continent was indeed frozen and notionally undiscovered 500 years ago, in order for Piri Reis to have that information, he would have needed to have gotten it from somewhere. Mr. Hancock notes that Piri Reis was using the great libraries of Constantinople, which in his day would have included sources from classical antiquity. And from there, perhaps there were documents that had been in the great and famous library of Alexandria. And from there, who knows what kind of documents were in the library of Alexandria? It could have been a treasure trove of now lost knowledge. And since we don't know what was in there, we can't say for sure that there weren't thousands of thousand-year-old maps in that library. Therefore, because we can't say for sure that it didn't exist, Piri Reis must have gotten his information from 10,000-year-old maps that had been stored at the Library of Alexandria and then transferred to Constantinople at some point during the classical period. This is, if I may be gentle, a rather tenuous chain. But it is indisputable that Mr. Hancock is right about the fact that we can't prove it didn't happen. What we can do, however, is accept, for the sake of argument, that there was 10,000-year-old cartographic information recorded in pictorial form which could be read in the 1500s. If that were the case, then the art of map-making would be an ancient one indeed. While the advanced Ice Age people might have been the best map-makers, We would expect that ancient people in the period between the Ice Age and the medieval period would habitually store, preserve, transmit, and use maps, even if they didn't make them necessarily. The problem with that is that maps which preserve cartographic information are unknown in the ancient Near East. Now, there do exist maps, but these barely manage to encode the relative directions of various locations, and have none of what we would call navigationally useful cartographic information of the sort that is supposedly encoded about the Antarctic coastline. We've talked about this before, but in the ancient world, people make sense of their world via itineraries. These are lists of places that you need to travel to get from one place to another, and they are extremely useful in oral cultures, as they can be easily transmitted person to person. Cartographic information, however, the specific squiggles that correspond to particular contours on a coastline, that needs to be transmitted on a written medium, and over the span of 10,000 years would require a class of scribes capable and interested in copying that information again and again, at least every 1,000 years or so. While a map of distant lands would, in fact, be quite interesting to the ancient mind, assuming they could read it, we can be almost certain that no such thing exists, because there was no class of map copiers or map preservers among the scribes in the ancient world. If they were able to read such a map of the world, they would have used it. But instead we know that they used itineraries, and did a rather poor job in the few places where they did use schematic maps, which were themselves little better than the itineraries that they replaced. Fundamentally, the absence of maps that Mr. Hancock postulates must exist make it extremely unlikely that Piri Reis had access to any such thing. And contrary to Mr. Hancock's belief, our options are not A, that there were Ice Age cartographers whose work survived over 10,000 years without any intermediate preservation steps, or B, that the map is completely inexplicable. In fact, there are at least two other options. C, that Piri Reis was attempting to represent what is now the coast of Argentina, or D, that Piri Reis, like many ancient map makers, really were just putting squiggles on the bottom that kind of happened to look vaguely like ice-free Antarctica. Coincidences really do happen, and over many thousands of years of human history, you can collect a fair few of them if you spend all your time looking. But then, having now looked at how to do archaeology wrong, I don't want to sound like a miserable person who doesn't want to find ancient civilizations. I'm not some entrenched interest deep in the heart of academia. I'm a guy with a podcast. If there was a cool ancient civilization, I would love to know about it. And if I ever get time, I would happily cover it. There are these, cities under lakes and buried in South China and Southeast Asia that are this civilization that we didn't know about because we have very little work done in Southeast Asia archaeologically. If we had a narrative of those people, you can bet that is Oldest Stories Season 3, straight up. But so let's look at how we actually discover an ancient civilization, looking at a time when it actually happened. Now, our story starts with Leonard Wolseley, one of the big names in Mesopotamian archaeology from 100 years ago. Now, the story goes, one day he was excavating at Tel al-Ubaid, finding human artifacts as he dug. Then as he kept going down, the stratigraphy and relative context clues told him he was getting more and more ancient, until he reached a stone and pottery culture that seemed to be far more ancient than the Sumerian and Uruk periods above it. And by far older, I mean from about 6000 to 4000 BCE, though I don't know that he had dated it quite so cleanly in his own day. He collected a large number of pots and stone tools and building remains and other human detritus, all from the same stratigraphic layer. And when he looked at the functions of everything, he found it appeared to be consistent with a fairly advanced Neolithic society. Now, by fairly advanced, we mean had pottery, early agriculture, and tool working, but still less advanced than the Uruk period city that followed it or was above it stratigraphically. And once he had established this, he noted that the pottery all seemed to have a somewhat consistent style, so he decided that this represents a unified culture, distinct from the later cultures that lived at this site. Not having a name for these people, he called them the Ubaid culture, after Tel al-Ubaid, where he found them. And now soon enough, other archaeologists started reaching that deeper stratigraphic level and started finding similar functional and cultural artifacts were appearing at similar levels. Now there was debate and discussion initially as to whether these artifacts were similar enough to represent the same culture or not, but it was ultimately agreed by most that the evidence suggests a somewhat unified culture of early agriculturalists which existed throughout Mesopotamia from about 6000 to 4000 BCE, and we call them the Ubaids. We know very little about these people. We have no narrative of their history, we have no real sense of their religion or culture beyond their material remains. And there's even an open question as to whether or not these are the ancestors of the Sumerians or the Akkadians, or if they were a separate people. And this despite 100 years of archaeology. Now that story is less exciting than claiming to have discovered an Ice Age civilization that once sailed around the planet, left a bunch of records that existed until just when people started looking for them, and apparently took so many drugs that it gave them telekinetic powers. But it is the correct way to get our hands on the actual history of humanity. But what I've described is a very slow and methodical process, and it's not really accessible to most people until it's basically done. Most of us have questions about the past, and no doubt there are many things that we've seen that don't quite fit with the standard historical picture. So I want to close out with the proper way to ask and answer controversial or difficult archaeological claims. Our example today is going to be that there are some who suspect that horses may have existed in Central or North America during the pre-Columbian period. Now, when you have a claim like that, there's always something that motivates these claims. And that doesn't mean they're improperly motivated. In this case, there's two general kinds of people that claim this sort of thing. First, there are various creation myths among the Diné people of North America that feature horses. Secondly, the Book of Mormon, which claims to be a record of the ancient Americas, claims there may have been horses between 600 BCE and 400 CE. Now, the first thing we do is examine our motivating claims. This is step one, and it's often the most important step. Our first claim that horses are in the Diné creation myths is only a valid evidence if we believe that oral tradition is very stable over many generations. This is a disputed claim, and actually it's a very lively debate, with some claiming that oral traditions have been measured to shift even within living memory, while others put forward reasons to believe that oral traditions can be incredibly stable in certain key areas, even over centuries. Now, depending on our position in that debate, we can either reject this completely or tentatively accept it, But the mere fact that it's such a contentious debate should make us relatively open to the possibility of being wrong in either direction. So our first evidence is fairly weak. The second evidence comes from the Book of Mormon, which of course many people are going to reject outright, and even many among the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will claim it doesn't actually show that there were horses in the New World prior to Columbus, that in fact those passages are quirks of translation and actually refer perhaps to tapirs or domesticated deer or some such. Identifying and translating the names of specific animal and plant species is notoriously difficult. And so, this is also fairly weak evidence on its own. But let's say that we take these two motivating evidences as reason to investigate further. The very first thing we do, now that we have acknowledged honestly the strengths and weaknesses of our starting point, is to ask, what evidence would prove our case? The most obvious one would be horse bones dated to the pre-Columbian era. Second would be visual or written depictions of horses among pre-Columbian peoples. And there's probably more evidences we could sit and think of, but let's just take those two, because here we meet our first obstacle. People have never found horse bones dated to be the period between the putative extinction of American horses around 10,000 BCE and the reintroduction of the horses by the Spanish around 1600-ish. However, it is claimed by supporters of the pre-Columbian horse theory that these bones have never been found because horse bones are not routinely dated during American archaeological investigations, and often they are automatically excluded as anachronistic intrusions. And so the burden falls upon pre-Columbian horse theorists to find some horse bones during the relative period. And, as of 2022, it seems that at least one study has found exactly that. Now, does this mean that there certainly were horses in pre-Columbian America? No, of course not, as even that study's authors state. They still need to find more evidence in more context to properly establish this claim, and each study needs to be rigorously cross-examined for methodological validity. And there are also some claims that some of the animals depicted in some ancient Mayan stelae may be horses, but these two are difficult claims, as the ancient Maya were not photorealistic representational artists focused on careful depictions of the shape of everything, but rather, like most ancient cultures, they depicted things in their own aesthetic and symbolic fashions, making a literal identification from these images difficult without a lot more context and many more examples. And I'm going to close out on that as we're already quite long. I don't know that I did a great job explaining the fundamentals of the philosophy of archaeology. It really is a pretty deep well, and I only have a few small buckets from which to draw upon it. But hopefully this ramble through some disorganized examples will help at least someone. Because the most important thing, if you're a fan of Graham Hancock, or if you're a skeptic of his claims, or even if you just really hope that there were horses getting sacrificed at Mayan ball courts, is that if you want to advance a controversial claim, you need to put in decades of field work, often to find the evidence in the proper fashion. And that's miserable. That's miserable and expensive and difficult. And this is a place where I'm going to give Mr. Hancock genuine credit. He claims that evidence for his lost civilization will be found, and he's given suggestions for where people should dig. With his literary skills, he's inspired a new generation of people to either become archaeologists or just support the search for more lost cultures. He's provided an impetus to do more archaeology. And that's really what we need. More digging, more cataloging, more investigating. If we find Hancock's ancient civilization, then the world at large can celebrate. And if we don't find that, then, we're gonna find something. Just because what we're likely to find is more conventional ancient peoples doesn't mean that our search has failed. Those ancient peoples had ancient stories, and we can't tell them. We can't get closer to our human ancestors. We can't deepen our understanding of the human condition. We can't turn the hearts of the sons to the fathers without that grand search. And then, only hours before I go to record this, I've been given one other place to give Mr. Hancock genuine credit by Dr. David Falk, link in the description. He doesn't know who I am, but he just published a video on the consensus pressures in the academic world. The idea of novel thinkers being persecuted to some extent by the intellectual sphere is one I think most of us are familiar with, but Mr. Hancock's large audience and genuine attitude of seeking has exposed to many people the dismissive scorn that many experts have for him. Like a lot of the people who have asked me about Mr. Hancock, they're not experts, and they don't know how to evaluate his claims. I understand the frustration of being a non-expert, looking into some field that's not my own and going, man, I don't even know where to start with these people. And so the people who are Hancock fans, most of them, they don't know how to evaluate his claims, but they can tell right away when they encounter a mocking, scornful debunking, and that his ideas are not being given a fair shake. And so in closing, I've been asked about Graham Hancock by the people in my life, and I hope that if you're a fan of his, you're now more equipped to investigate his methods more closely. I hope also, whether you're a Hancock fan or not, that you're able to investigate the claims of historians in general more thoroughly. An episode like this is just the start, and there is far more that can and should be said on this topic. But that's all I have time for. That's all I have for you. What turned out to be a bigger tangent than I was expecting. So next time we're getting back to Mesopotamia, specifically the Middle Euphrates region, as we take a look at the curious case of the Suhu Rebellion. So join us next time for a condemnatio, a beekeeper, and a rebellion that must surely have shamed the entire Assyrian Empire. Thank you for listening.